111 degrees. That was the temperature baking the concrete of my driveway in Scottsdale, Arizona on a Tuesday afternoon. The kind of heat that doesn't just make you sweat. It physically assaults you. It scrambles your brain, melts the soles of your sneakers, and makes you question why humanity ever decided to settle in a desert. I was standing there in gym shorts and a soaked t-shirt, clutching a dripping brass hose nozzle, just trying to keep my front lawn from turning into a pile of spontaneous ash. Have you ever tried to water a lawn in that kind of heat? It's a losing battle. The water practically evaporates before it even hits the dirt. My phone started vibrating in my pocket. Now, usually, I ignore calls when I'm locked in mortal combat with the Arizona sun, but the caller ID showed it was my main client. The kind of client who pays the mortgage. The kind of client who doesn't do leave a voicemail. I dropped the hose right there on the grass, the water sputtering to a halt, and sprinted inside to the glorious sanctuary of my air-conditioned living room. I figured I would be inside for 3 minutes. 5, tops. I would put out the client's fire, walk back out, coil up the hose, and get on with my life. I was on the phone for exactly 12 minutes. 12. I timed it later, just to be sure. When I hung up and opened my front door to head back into the furnace, I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing on my driveway, practically hovering over the green rubber hose I had left uncoiled on the grass, was Brenda. Every neighborhood has a Brenda. She was the president of our homeowners association. She possessed an asymmetrical blonde bob that looked sharp enough to cut glass, wore sensible khaki capris, and wielded a metal clipboard like it was the hammer of Thor. "Jacob," she said. She didn't yell. She didn't have to. She had that tone. You know the one? That condescending, nasal drawl of a middle school principal who just caught you running in the hallway. "Hey, Brenda," I said, squinting against the glare of the sun, stepping down off my porch. "Hot one today, huh?" "It is an absolute hazard, Jacob. A hazard and an eyesore." She tapped her pen against the metal clip of her board. Click, click, click. I looked around, genuinely confused. "What's a hazard? Did a coyote die in the street again?" "Your hose." She pointed the pen at the 50 feet of standard green garden hose laying harmlessly across my dying grass. "It is uncoiled. It is exposed. It is a direct violation of Section 4, Paragraph B of the Community Guidelines." I stared at her. I looked at the hose, then back at her. "Brenda, I was inside for 10 minutes taking a work call. I was literally right in the middle of watering." "The rules do not care about your phone calls, Jacob. The rules are the rules to maintain the aesthetic integrity of this community." Aesthetic integrity? Half the lawns on this block look like deep-fried straw right now. "Watch your tone," she snapped, stepping closer, her eyes narrowing behind her polarized sunglasses. "We live in a premium community. We do not leave our landscaping equipment strewn about like a junkyard. It's trashy. It lowers property values, and frankly, it's disrespectful to your neighbors." I felt my blood pressure spike. It wasn't just the heat anymore, it was the absolute absurdity of the situation. Disrespectful? It's a hose. It blends in with the grass. And I was coming right back out to put it away. "Intention does not negate violation," she said, reciting it like a mantra she practiced in the mirror every morning. She ripped a pink piece of paper off her clipboard. It was already filled out. She must have written it while I was inside, standing out here in the boiling sun just waiting for me to emerge. "This is a citation." You've got to be kidding me. I do not kid about community standards, because this is your second violation this year. My first violation was because my trash cans were out 2 hours past the pickup window. "Because this is your second violation," she continued, raising her voice over mine, It comes with an immediate penalty, $500. I froze. $500? For leaving a hose on the grass for 12 minutes? Payable within 14 days, or a lien will be placed on your property. Good day, Jacob. She slapped the pink slip onto the side of my mailbox, turned on her heel, and marched down the sidewalk toward her own pristine, aggressively manicured house. I stood there in the heat, the pink paper fluttering slightly in the dry wind. I didn't yell after her. I didn't throw a fit. I just walked over, peeled the citation off the mailbox, and looked at it. $500 for egregious visual pollution. A normal person might have just paid the fine, complained to their friends over a beer, and moved on. But as you guys know, I am not a normal person. When someone weaponizes a rule book against me, I don't just get mad, I get completely, obsessively, meticulously even. I walked inside, locked the door, and went straight to my home office. I booted up my computer, cracked open a cold can of sparkling water, and logged into the HOA homeowner portal. I downloaded the CC&Rs, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions. It was a PDF document that was 94 pages long. 94 pages dictating exactly what color you could paint your trim, how tall your fence could be, and what type of vehicles you could park in your driveway. I hit Control F and searched for hose. There it was. Section 4, Paragraph B. Garden hoses must be coiled, stored, and hidden from public view unless actively in use for landscaping irrigation. I read it once. I read it twice. I leaned back in my desk chair and stared at the ceiling. Unless actively in use for landscaping irrigation. The wheels in my brain started turning. The friction was smoking. If the hose is actively in use, it doesn't have to be hidden. But what defines actively in use? Does someone have to be holding it? The rulebook didn't say that. It just said in use. I opened a new tab. I started digging into Arizona state law. HOAs think they have absolute power, but they are still subordinate to state statutes. And living in a desert means water is a highly regulated commodity. I scrolled through property laws until I hit the motherlode, Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 33, 1916. It was a beautiful, glorious piece of legislation. It explicitly prohibited homeowners associations from banning water-saving plants, artificial turf, and, most importantly, xeriscape landscaping. Basically, the state of Arizona says that if a homeowner wants to implement drought-tolerant landscaping and irrigation to save water, the HOA cannot legally stop them. Any HOA rule that conflicts with water conservation is instantly null and void. A slow, wicked grin spread across my face. I picked up my phone and called my buddy Mike. Mike is a real estate attorney. He's the kind of guy who thrives on finding loopholes, the kind of guy who reads contracts for fun on a Friday night. "Mike," I said as soon as he picked up, "I need a legal definition." "Hello to you too, Jake. What did you do this time?" "Nothing. Yet. How does the law define actively in use when it comes to an irrigation system?" I could hear him shuffling papers on his end. "Context? Because if you're talking about farm equipment, it's one thing. If you're talking about residential, my HOA says hoses must be hidden unless actively in use for landscaping irrigation. If I hook a hose up to a pump and water is continuously flowing through it, is it actively in use?" "Technically, yes," Mike said slowly. "If it is serving a functional, ongoing purpose for irrigation, it is active." "Why? What are you planning?" Brenda just slapped me with a $500 fine for leaving my hose out for 12 minutes. Mike groaned. Just pay the fine, Jake. It's not worth the headache. HOAs are a nightmare to fight. I'm not fighting her, I said, pulling up the Home Depot website on my monitor. I am going to comply with her rules. I am going to comply so hard it makes her head spin. Tell me about ARS 333-1816. The Xeriscape law? It protects homeowners who install drought mitigation landscaping. HOAs can't prohibit you from setting up systems that conserve water. But Jake, you have a grass lawn. Not for long. If I install a closed-loop irrigation system for a drought-tolerant plant, and that system requires the use of a hose, and that hose is constantly running to keep the plant alive, the HOA can't make me hide it, right? Because it's actively in use, and it's protected by state law. Silence on the other end of the line. Then a heavy sigh. Technically, yes. If you have a legitimate, functioning Xeriscape irrigation system, state law trumps the CC&Rs. But a standard garden hose doesn't qualify as a permanent system. But what if the hose is the system? I asked. Jake, what are you doing? I'm building a labyrinth, Mike. Thanks for the consult. I hung up before he could talk me out of it. I turned my attention back to the Home Depot website. I didn't want a standard green hose. Green blends in. Green is polite. If I was going to do this, I needed something that would burn a hole in Brenda's retinas every time she looked out her window. I searched for agricultural hoses. I needed length, and I needed durability. And then I found it. Industrial-grade, reinforced polyurethane agricultural tubing. It was designed for massive commercial farming operations. It was thick, heavy-duty, and meant to withstand extreme UV exposure. And it came in a color designated as neon magenta. It was the brightest, most obnoxious, radioactive pink I had ever seen. I quickly checked the HOA CC&Rs again. I went to the landscaping section. It had a highly restrictive color palette for house paint, trim, fences, and even driveway pavers. But nowhere, absolutely nowhere, did it dictate the required color of a garden hose. They never thought they had to, because the rule stated hoses had to be hidden anyway. I did the math. My front yard was roughly a quarter acre of flat, dying grass. To properly cover every square inch of that space, weaving back and forth, I would need a massive amount of material. I added 5,000 feet of neon magenta agricultural hose to my cart. Then, I went to the pump section. I needed something low-flow. I didn't want to actually waste water, I just needed the system to be active. I found a specialized, solar-powered micro-irrigation pump. It was designed to pull water from a reservoir and push it through a line at an incredibly slow rate. I also bought a 50-gallon rain barrel, a single-potted Arizona barrel cactus, and a digital flow meter to mathematically prove the water was moving. My credit card company actually flagged the transaction. I had to approve it via text message. The total came out to just under $4,000. Was it a ridiculous amount of money to spend out of spite? Absolutely. But this wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the principle. It was about sovereign ruling. It was about sending a message that you do not mess with a man's right to water his lawn. I paid the $500 fine online, making sure to select the Under Protest checkbox, and requested expedited freight shipping for my supplies. The stage was set. The trap was laid. All I had to do now was wait for the delivery truck, and Brenda's perfectly manicured suburban dictatorship was going to come crashing down in a tangled web of neon pink plastic. Here is the continuation of the story, picking up right where we left off. The delivery happened on a Thursday morning, and honestly, it was like something out of a weird fever dream. I mean, I knew I ordered a lot of hose, but seeing it arrive is a completely different experience. An 18-wheeler literally had to block both lanes of our pristine, street-swept suburban road just to lower the liftgate. 3 massive wooden pallets, each stacked 6 feet high with giant spools of shrink-wrapped neon magenta agricultural tubing. It was so bright it physically hurt to look at. Like, if Barbie decided to start a commercial farming operation in the apocalypse, this is exactly what she would use. Mrs. Higgins from across the street was literally peeking through her plantation blinds. I could see the slats moving. I just stood out there on the driveway, drinking my coffee, signing the freight manifest while the delivery driver gave me this look of pure, unadulterated concern. He didn't ask questions. He just dropped the pallets, handed me the slip, and got the hell out of there. Now, obviously, I couldn't build this thing alone. I mean, 5,000 feet of heavy-duty industrial tubing is basically a mile, a literal mile of plastic. So I made a call to a local landscaping contractor I knew, a guy named Sal. Sal is this grizzled, leathery dude in his late 50s who permanently smells like diesel fuel, mulch, and cheap cigars. He runs a crew of 3 guys who work harder in the Arizona heat than anyone I've ever met. But the most important thing about Sal, he absolutely, fundamentally despised Brenda. About 2 years ago, Sal was doing a massive paver installation down the street. He parked his work truck, a perfectly normal standard-issue Ford F-250, on the street in front of the house for like 3 hours, while his crew was unloading gravel. Brenda swooped in like a hawk and slapped a $200 commercial vehicle violation on the homeowner, who then tried to deduct it from Sal's final invoice. Sal ended up paying it just to keep the peace. But he never forgot. He holds a grudge, like it's a family heirloom. When Sal's battered truck pulled up to my curb an hour later, he stepped out, adjusted his sunglasses, and just stared at the towering pallets of pink plastic on my driveway. He didn't say a word for a solid minute. He just chewed on his toothpick. "Hey, Sal," I said, walking over with a rolled-up piece of grid paper. He slowly pointed a calloused finger at the pallets. "Jake, what in the name of God is that?" "That, Sal, is my new irrigation system, and I need you and the boys to help me install it." He looked at me, then back at the pink mountain. "I don't do commercial aquaponics, kid. I do lawns, pavers, retaining walls. I don't know what kind of Breaking Bad stuff you're setting up here, but it's not a farm, Sal," I interrupted, unrolling the grid paper and holding it up. "It's a xeriscape drought mitigation system, protected under Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 33, 1916. Sal pulled down his sunglasses. He looked at the paper. I had spent 4 hours the night before mapping out my quarter-acre front lawn on a grid. I drew an intricate geometric labyrinth. It looked like a giant fingerprint made of concentric squares and switchbacks with exactly 1 inch of spacing between each line of hose. "So you want me to weave this?" Sal paused, trying to find the words. "Like a giant neon rug? On your lawn?" "Exactly. A giant neon rug. Every single inch of this 5,000 feet needs to be staked down to the dirt, starting from the edge of the driveway, winding back and forth across the entire yard, and ending dead center in the middle." Sal sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Jake, why? Just why? This is gonna kill your grass." "My grass is already dead, Sal. And more importantly, Brenda fined me $500 on Tuesday for leaving a green garden hose on the lawn for 12 minutes. Because it wasn't, quote, actively in use." I watched the realization wash over Sal's leathery face. The toothpick in his mouth stopped moving. He looked at the pallets of aggressively pink hose. He looked at the blueprints. He looked down the street toward Brenda's immaculate 2-story stucco fortress. A slow, terrifying grin started to crack across his face, revealing a gold crown on one of his back teeth. "So," Sal muttered, his voice dropping an octave, "you're telling me this entire pink monstrosity is going to be an active irrigation system? Pumping water?" "Yep, I nodded. Closed loop, solar-powered micro pump, constantly running, totally legal. And because it's a drought-tolerant xeriscape setup, the HOA can't legally make me remove it or hide it. Sal stared at Brenda's house for another few seconds. Then he turned around and yelled at his crew, who were waiting in the truck. "Hector! Luis! Grab the sledgehammers and every single landscaping staple we got in the rig. We're building a maze." He turned back to me, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. "I'll get the stakes, kid. You're a sick, beautiful lunatic." Honestly, the build was brutal. I mean, we are talking about manual labor in 110-degree weather. The sun was just pounding down on us like a physical weight. We started by ripping out whatever was left of my dead grass, so we had a flat dirt canvas. Then, the weaving began. It was a nightmare of geometry. Sal and his guys had to unspool the heavy polyurethane tubing, lay it perfectly straight, hammer down a metal landscaping staple every 3 feet, turn a perfect 90-degree angle, and run it all the way back. Back and forth, over and over. Line after line of radioactive magenta baking in the desert sun. I was out there with them, hammering stakes until my hands were covered in blisters, chugging Gatorade like it was the elixir of life. By noon, half the neighborhood was on the sidewalk watching us. It literally looked like an alien crop circle made of bubblegum. Some people were laughing. Others were just staring in open-mouthed horror. I guess it was a lot to process. Right in the dead center of the yard, I set up the heart of the operation. I placed the 50-gallon rain barrel on a cinder block stand and filled it with water from my outdoor spigot. Beside it, I placed the solar-powered micro pump I bought. And right in the middle of it all, sitting on a little decorative patio stone, was a single, small, slightly depressed-looking Arizona barrel cactus in a terracotta pot. We ran the very beginning of the 5,000-foot hose into the output valve of the pump. The end of the hose, the literal end of the mile-long maze, was routed into the top of the terracotta pot, positioned just above the cactus soil. The runoff from the pot drained through a tube right back into the rain barrel. It was a perfectly closed loop. I flipped the switch on the solar pump. It hummed to life with a quiet, satisfying, mechanical purr. I checked the digital flow meter. Water was pushing through the labyrinth. It took almost 20 minutes for the pressure to carry the water through all 5,000 feet of tubing. But finally, we saw it. Drip. A single drop of water fell from the end of the magenta hose onto the cactus dirt. Exactly 60 seconds later, drip. I looked at Sal. Sal looked at me. We were drenched in sweat, covered in dirt, and surrounded by a front yard that looked like a glitch in the Matrix. "It's active," Sal whispered reverently. "It's actively in use for landscaping irrigation," I confirmed, wiping my forehead with a filthy towel. "What in God's name is happening here?" The screech was so loud it practically shattered the humid air. I didn't even have to turn around. I knew that voice. Brenda was marching across the street, moving so fast she was practically levitating. Her face was a shade of purple I had never seen on a human being before. It clashed horribly with her khaki caprice. Behind her, trailing like a terrified remora fish, was her husband, Gary. Gary always looked like he was one loud noise away from a heart attack. I leaned on my sledgehammer, put on my best customer service smile, and waved. "Hey, Brenda, just doing a little landscaping. Sal's doing a great job, right?" Sal tipped his sweat-stained baseball cap at her. "Afternoon, ma'am." Brenda stopped at the edge of my driveway, her eyes wide, darting erratically across the endless sea of neon pink tubing covering my entire property. Her mouth opened and closed a few times like a fish gasping for air. You You, Jacob, what is this? What is this abomination? It's my new drought mitigation xeriscape system, I said casually, taking a sip of water. I realized you were completely right the other day. Leaving a hose out when it isn't actively watering something is just bad form. So I took your advice to heart. I upgraded to a highly efficient, closed-loop irrigation model. Saves water, saves money. It's pink, she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the lawn. It is neon pink garbage. You have turned your property into a circus, a hazardous waste site. This is a direct violation of community standards. Actually, I said, pulling a folded copy of the CCNRs out of my back pocket. I read the guidelines very carefully. There are strict rules on the color of houses, trims, doors, and roofs, but there is absolutely no regulation on the color of irrigation tubing. None. Because you're supposed to hide it, she shrieked, stomping her foot. Literally, an adult woman stomping her foot. The rules clearly state hoses must be hidden from public view. Ah, but read the rest of the sentence, Brenda, I said, holding up a finger. Unless actively in use for landscaping irrigation, and as you can see, I gestured grandly toward the center of the labyrinth where the tiny cactus sat. It is actively in use. Brenda pushed past me, ignoring the property line, and stomped into the middle of the maze. She stared at the little terracotta pot. She stared at the solar pump. Drip. A single drop of water hit the dirt. It's dripping, she whispered, her voice shaking with rage. It's dripping 1 drop of water. It's a very low-flow system, I explained, trying not to laugh. Desert plants are very sensitive to overwatering. Gotta be careful. You are mocking me, she yelled, spinning around. You think you're clever? You think you can just exploit the rules? I will have a lien on this house by tomorrow. I will fine you $1,000 a day for unapproved architectural modifications. I will have a crew here to rip this plastic trash out of the ground. If you touch my property, Brenda, I'll have you arrested for trespassing and vandalism, I said, my voice dropping the friendly customer service tone. And if the HOA tries to fine me for an active xeriscape irrigation system, I will immediately file a lawsuit against the board for violating Arizona Revised Statutes Section 33 to 1816, which explicitly prohibits you from restricting homeowners from installing water conservation landscaping. I've already cleared it with my attorney. That stopped her. The color drained from her purple face, leaving a weird, splotchy red. She knew I had her. The HOA board members were legally trained on state supremacy laws, mainly because they had been sued before. She knew exactly what statute I was talking about. She stared at me with pure, unfiltered hatred. You have not heard the last of this, Jacob. You think you've won? I am calling an emergency board meeting. I am calling the city code enforcers. I am calling the police. Call whoever you want, Brenda, I said, turning back to Sal. Hey, Sal, we got any more staples? I think this corner is looking a little loose. Brenda let out a sound that was half scream, half growl, and stormed off my property, dragging poor Gary behind her by the elbow. Sal watched her go, chuckling low in his chest. I'm not gonna lie to you, kid, he said, handing me another box of metal stakes. I would have done this job for free just to see the look on her face. I'll remember that when I get your invoice, I laughed. But honestly, I knew Brenda wasn't bluffing. She was a woman who had built her entire identity around neighborhood compliance. She was going to throw everything she had at me. The police, the board, the city. She was going to mobilize the entire suburban army. But I was ready. The pink labyrinth was active, the pump was running, and I had the law on my side. Let the games begin. Brenda wasn't kidding about calling the authorities. I mean, I honestly thought it would take her at least an hour or two to figure out who to complain to. But she must have literally sprinted back to her house and dialed 911, the second she crossed her threshold. Sal and the guys had just finished packing up their tools into the F-250. We were standing in the driveway, admiring the glowing, radioactive pink glory of the Labyrinth, drinking some ice-cold lemon-lime Gatorades, when the first black and white Scottsdale PD cruiser slowly rolled around the corner. And then a second one. Because apparently, my front lawn was now a Level 5 national security threat. The two cruisers didn't even pull into my driveway. They just parked right in the middle of the street, lights flashing, completely blocking traffic. I guess when dispatch gets a frantic call about a hazardous chemical situation and a deranged individual destroying the neighborhood, they don't exactly take their time. 2 officers stepped out of the first car, and a third stepped out of the second. They all had their hands resting casually near their belts, eyes scanning the area for whatever mass casualty event Brenda had described over the phone. But instead of a toxic waste spill or a hostage situation, they were greeted by me, Sal, and a 5,000-foot maze of aggressively pink plastic tubing baking in the afternoon sun. The lead officer, a tall guy with a buzz cut and a name tag that read Officer Miller, stopped dead in his tracks about 10 feet from the property line. He slowly took off his aviator sunglasses. He just stared. I mean, he literally stood there in silence for a solid 30 seconds, trying to process the visual assault of the magenta labyrinth. "Afternoon, officers," I called out cheerfully, tossing my empty Gatorade bottle into the recycling bin. I walked over to the edge of the grass, or, well, the edge of the dirt where the grass used to be. "Hot one out here today, huh? Can I help you guys with something?" Officer Miller blinked, snapping out of his trance. He looked at me, then looked back at the lawn. "Dispatch got a call from a neighbor. Said there was some kind of industrial chemical leak, or a hazardous waste dump being constructed in a residential zone." I let out a loud laugh. "A chemical leak? Honestly, that's a new one. No, sir, no chemicals here. Just H2O. Before the officer could even ask his next question, the unmistakable sound of Brenda's sensible flats slapping against the pavement echoed down the street. She was power-walking toward us, clutching her metal clipboard like it was a shield, with poor Gary jogging behind her, looking like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. "Officers!" Brenda shrieked, waving her free hand frantically. "Officers, thank goodness you're here! Look at this! Just look at it! He is destroying the neighborhood. He's building some kind of toxic dumping ground. It's an environmental hazard." Officer Miller held up a hand to stop her. "Ma'am, please lower your voice. Are you the one who called this in?" "Yes, I am the president of the Homeowners Association," she declared, puffing out her chest. "And this man is in direct, flagrant violation of community standards. He is a nuisance to the public, and I demand you shut this down immediately." The second officer, a younger guy named Davis, walked up next to Miller. He leaned over and whispered something, pointing at the center of the maze. Miller squinted, then looked back at me. "Sir, what exactly is this?" Miller asked, gesturing vaguely at the ocean of pink plastic. "It's a xeriscape drought mitigation system, officer," I said, putting on my most polite, cooperative citizen voice. "I'm just doing my part for water conservation. As you know, living in the desert, water is our most precious resource. My HOA president here," I gestured to Brenda, who looked like she was about to spontaneously combust, "reminded me earlier today that it's highly inefficient to leave a standard hose out. So I upgraded." "Upgraded," Miller repeated flatly. "Yep, to a closed-loop, ultra-low-flow agricultural irrigation network." I gestured for the cops to follow me. "Come on, I'll give you the grand tour. It's totally safe, I promise." The 3 cops exchanged baffled looks, but their curiosity clearly won out. They carefully stepped onto the dirt, navigating the narrow spaces between the pink lines of hose, while Brenda screamed from the sidewalk about them needing a warrant or something completely irrelevant. I led them to the center of the labyrinth. I pointed to the 50-gallon rain barrel, the little solar-powered micro-pump humming quietly in the sun. And finally, the the single potted barrel cactus sitting in the middle of it all. "See?" I said, pointing to the end of the hose suspended over the pot. We all stood there in silence for about 50 seconds. Drip. A single drop of water fell onto the dry soil. Officer Davis, the younger cop, let out a noise that sounded suspiciously like a snort. He slapped a hand over his mouth and turned around, his shoulders shaking. "It drips 1 drop of water a minute," I explained, completely deadpan. "It takes a lot of pressure to push that water through 5,000 feet of tubing, but it's incredibly efficient. Saves hundreds of gallons a month compared to a sprinkler system." Officer Miller stared at the tiny cactus. He stared at the massive pump setup. He looked at the endless miles of pink tubing zigzagging across the entire quarter-acre. Then he looked at me. I could see the exact moment his brain connected all the dots. He saw the sheer, unadulterated spite radiating from the setup. 5,000 feet, Miller said slowly. "Give or take a few yards," I nodded. "For 1 cactus." "It's a very thirsty cactus, sir." Davis couldn't hold it in anymore. He let out a loud, barking laugh, immediately trying to disguise it as a cough. The third officer was just staring at the sky, biting his lower lip so hard it was turning white, trying desperately to maintain his professional composure. Miller took a deep breath, composed himself, and turned back to face the sidewalk where Brenda was practically vibrating with rage. He walked back through the maze, and I followed right behind him. "Well, ma'am," Miller said, hooking his thumbs into his belt. "I've inspected the property. There are no hazardous chemicals. There's no environmental leak. It's just water." "It's a monstrosity!" Brenda yelled, pointing her pen at me. "It is an illegal modification of his property. It's visual pollution." "That may be, ma'am, but visual pollution isn't a criminal offense," Miller said, his tone getting a lot more firm. "This is a civil matter. It's between him, you, and your HOA board. The police department does not enforce HOA bylaws." "You can't just leave it like this," she sputtered, her perfectly styled bob literally frizzing in the humidity. "He is mocking the rules. Look at it. It's pink." "I don't care if it's polka-dotted, ma'am," Miller replied, clearly losing his patience. "He's not breaking any state or city criminal laws. In fact, if he's running an irrigation system, he's probably protected by state utility and landscaping statutes. Either way, it's not a police issue. Do not call 911 again for a landscaping dispute, or I will cite you for misuse of emergency services. Do you understand?" Brenda looked like she had just been slapped in the face with a wet fish. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then glared at me with a level of pure malice that I honestly respect. "This isn't over," she hissed at me, her voice trembling. "I am calling an emergency hearing of the board. I will have a lien on this house so fast it will make your head spin. You are done here, Jacob." She spun around and marched away, Gary trailing behind her like a sad, deflated balloon. Once she was out of earshot, Officer Miller turned back to me. The stern cop persona completely melted away, and a massive grin broke across his face. "I gotta tell you, man," Miller said, shaking his head. "I've been on the force for 14 years. I have responded to noise complaints, property line disputes, neighbors throwing dog poop over fences. But this is the most beautifully petty thing I have ever seen in my entire life." "I aim to please, officer," I smiled. Officer Davis walked up, holding his smartphone. "Hey, my wife is dealing with a psycho HOA president over in Chandler right now. Do you mind if I—" He gestured with his phone toward the pink labyrinth. "Take all the pictures you want, guys," I laughed. "It's a public installation at this point." The 3 cops spent the next 5 minutes taking selfies with the giant neon pink maze, laughing their heads off, before finally piling back into their cruisers and driving away. Sal, who had been sitting on the tailgate of his truck watching the whole thing, just slowly clapped his hands. Kid, Sal said, shaking his head in awe. You are a goddamn artist. Send me a picture of her face when you finally break her. He hopped in his rig and drove off, leaving me alone with my masterpiece. The next 48 hours were exactly as chaotic as you would expect. My house became a local tourist attraction. Seriously, people from 3 neighborhoods over were driving their golf carts down my street just to stare at the pink labyrinth. Teenagers were making TikToks on the sidewalk. The UPS guy asked if he could touch it. It was glorious. But Brenda was not sitting idle. She was a woman on a warpath. 2 days after the labyrinth was installed, I found a heavy, certified mail envelope taped to my front door. It was an official summons from the HOA. Notice of Emergency Board hearing and mandatory compliance. The letter stated that my property was in egregious violation of basically every aesthetic rule in the book, and an emergency meeting of the entire HOA board had been convened for Friday evening at the community clubhouse to formally address the unauthorized, hazardous, and visually offensive landscaping modifications. It threatened fines of $1,000 a day, property liens, and forced removal by a third-party contractor at my expense. I just smiled, took the letter inside, and grabbed my trusty 3-ring binder. I mean, honestly, this was exactly what I wanted. I didn't just want to annoy Brenda. I wanted to dismantle her authority in front of everyone. Friday evening rolled around. The heat had finally broken a little bit, dropping down to a balmy 98 degrees as I walked the 3 blocks to the community clubhouse. The parking lot was absolutely packed. I guess word had gotten around that the guy with the radioactive pink lawn was going to be publicly executed by the HOA board, and nobody wanted to miss the show. I walked through the double glass doors and into the main meeting room. It smelled heavily of chlorine from the adjoining community pool and stale percolator coffee. The room was filled with folding chairs, and almost every single one was taken. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years were whispering and pointing as I walked down the center aisle. At the front of the room was a long folding table. Sitting behind it was the 5-member HOA board, looking like the Supreme Court of petty grievances. And right in the center, flanked by 2 elderly women who looked like they lived on a diet of sour candies, was Brenda. She was wearing a sharp red blazer, her clipboard resting ominously on the table in front of her. To her right sat a guy in a cheap gray suit, holding a leather briefcase. I immediately clocked him as the HOA's retained legal counsel. I took a seat in the single empty folding chair, positioned directly in front of the board table. The hot seat. I placed my thick 3-ring binder on my lap and casually crossed my legs. Brenda banged a wooden gavel on the table. Where she even got a gavel, I have no idea. This emergency meeting of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association is now called to order, Brenda announced, her voice echoing through the cheap microphone set up on the table. She glared down at me. The primary agenda item tonight is the immediate and forceful remediation of the property located at 442 Sycamore Drive, owned by Jacob. The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit working overtime. Jacob, Brenda continued, her voice dripping with venom. 2 days ago, you installed a massive neon pink plastic eyesore that spans the entirety of your front property. You did not submit architectural plans. You did not request board approval. And you have blatantly violated the community guidelines regarding property aesthetics, visual harmony, and the storage of landscaping equipment. It's not equipment, Brenda, I said, leaning forward, skipping the microphone entirely. My voice carried just fine. It's an active irrigation system. It is a pile of trash, she snapped, losing her composure for a second before taking a deep breath and readjusting her blazer. You are attempting to exploit a loophole regarding the storage of hoses. But the board has convened, and we have determined that your installation does not qualify as a legitimate irrigation system. It is a spiteful, unauthorized architectural modification. She turned to the guy in the gray suit. We have our legal counsel present, Mr. Peterson. He has drafted a formal cease and desist, as well as a mandate authorizing the HOA to hire a crew tomorrow morning to rip that plastic monstrosity out of your yard at your expense. Furthermore, a lien will be placed on your property to cover the accumulated fines, which currently sit at $2,500. A collective gasp went through the room. A lien is the nuclear option in HOA land. It means you can't sell or refinance your house until the debt is paid. It's how they force people into submission. Brenda looked incredibly smug. She thought she had me backed into a corner. She thought I was just some idiot who bought a lot of hose for a prank and didn't realize the legal consequences. Do you have anything to say for yourself, Jacob, before the board officially votes to execute these penalties? Brenda asked, interlacing her fingers on the table. I stood up slowly. I picked up my heavy binder and dropped it onto the folding table right in front of Brenda with a loud, satisfying smack. Yeah, actually, I said, keeping my tone conversational, like we were discussing the weather. I have a lot to say, but first, let's talk about the law. I flipped the binder open to the first tab. As you all know, I started, turning slightly to address the crowd of neighbors behind me. Brenda fined me $500 on Tuesday for leaving a standard garden hose on my grass. She cited Section 4, Paragraph B of our CC&Rs, which states that hoses must be hidden unless actively in use for landscaping irrigation. I turned back to the board. So I decided to be a good neighbor. I decided to build an irrigation system that was permanently active. A closed-loop, solar-powered network designed to water a drought-tolerant Arizona barrel cactus. And because it is actively in use 24 hours a day, it does not have to be hidden under your own rules. That is an absurd interpretation of the rule, Brenda shouted. Nobody needs a mile of pink hose to water one cactus. Whether I need it or not is irrelevant, I shot back, tapping the paper in my binder. The rule dictates status, not efficiency. It is actively pumping water. I even brought a signed, notarized affidavit from a licensed municipal plumber. I pulled a piece of paper from the binder and slid it over to the lawyer, Mr. Peterson. He inspected the system yesterday. He legally certifies that it is a fully functioning, active, closed-loop irrigation system. Mr. Peterson took the paper, adjusted his glasses, and read it. He frowned slightly. "This is ridiculous," Brenda interrupted, grabbing the paper from the lawyer. "It doesn't matter what a plumber says. We are the HOA board. We decide what is an approved landscaping modification, and we do not approve neon pink plastic." "Actually, Brenda, you don't get to decide," I said, my voice dropping the friendly tone and going ice cold. "Because you are superseded by state law." I flipped to the second tab in my binder. It was a brightly highlighted printed copy of the Arizona state statutes. I direct your attention, and the attention of your legal counsel, to Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 33, 1816, I announced loudly, making sure the entire room heard me. This is state law, enacted to protect water conservation in a desert state. I'll read it out loud for the room. I cleared my throat. Notwithstanding any provision in the community documents, an association shall not prohibit the installation or use of drought-mitigating landscaping or water-conserving turf. It goes on to explicitly state that an HOA cannot enforce any rules that would force a homeowner to dismantle a functional xeriscape irrigation system. I looked dead at Brenda, whose face was slowly losing its color. "My labyrinth," I said, leaning over the table, is a functional, active, water-conserving xeriscape irrigation system. It is designed to sustain drought-tolerant flora because it requires the hose to remain on the surface for maximum solar pump efficiency. Any attempt by this HOA to force me to remove it, hide it, or fine me for its existence is a direct, flagrant violation of Arizona state law. The room was completely silent. You could hear a pin drop. I turned my attention to the lawyer in the gray suit. Mr. Peterson, as legal counsel for the Whispering Pines HOA, I need you to answer a question on the record in front of all these witnesses. Does an HOA CCNR guideline supersede an explicit Arizona state water conservation statute? Mr. Peterson looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a very fast, very bright truck. He looked at my binder. He looked at the printed statute. He looked at Brenda, who was staring at him with a mix of panic and fury. Mr. Peterson, I pressed. Yes or no? Can the HOA legally force me to tear up a functioning xeriscape irrigation system without violating ARS 33-1916? Mr. Peterson swallowed hard. He leaned over to Brenda, covering the microphone with his hand. I couldn't hear everything he said, but I definitely caught the phrases massive liability, class action potential, and state regulatory fines. Brenda's face went from pale to red to a deep, dangerous shade of purple. She snatched the microphone back. The board needs to review this documentation, Brenda stammered, her voice shaking. We will table this discussion until our legal team can verify these ridiculous claims. Oh, we're not tabling anything, Brenda, I said, crossing my arms. Because if you don't drop those fines right now, and if you don't publicly void that cease and desist, I am walking out of this clubhouse and filing a formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Water Resources tomorrow morning. I will report this board for attempting to illegally suppress state-mandated water conservation efforts. And you know they don't mess around with water laws in this state. They will audit every single rule this HOA has. The crowd behind me started murmuring. A few people actually clapped. Nobody liked Brenda. Nobody liked this board. And they were loving every single second of this absolute dismantling. Mr. Peterson frantically whispered in Brenda's ear again, practically begging her. He knew I had them dead to rights. If the state got involved, the HOA could face tens of thousands of dollars in municipal fines, and the board members could be held personally liable for legal fees. Brenda gripped the edges of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. She looked at me, her eyes burning with a hatred so intense it could have melted steel. But she had no moves left. Checkmate. Fine, she choked out, the word barely escaping her teeth. The board formally withdraws the cease and desist. The fines regarding the irrigation system are dismissed. And the original $500 fine? I asked, raising an eyebrow. The one for the green hose? Dismissed, she whispered into the microphone, looking completely defeated. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that for the record, I said, cupping my ear. Dismissed, she yelled, slamming the gavel down so hard the head actually flew off the handle and clattered across the floor. Meeting adjourned. She stood up, grabbed her clipboard, and practically sprinted out of the side door of the clubhouse, leaving the rest of the board sitting there in stunned silence. The room erupted into cheers and laughter. People were coming up to me, shaking my hand, slapping me on the back. It felt like I had just won the Super Bowl. Honestly, the victory was sweeter than I could have ever imagined. But the best part wasn't just winning the argument. It was the ripple effect it had on the entire neighborhood. About a week later, Brenda formally resigned from her position as HOA president. I guess the humiliation of being publicly outsmarted over a neon pink plastic maze was too much for her ego to handle. She put her house on the market a month later and moved to a gated community in Scottsdale, where I assume the CCNRs are enforced with military tribunals. As for the Labyrinth, it became a genuine local legend. For about 3 weeks, I left it exactly where it was. It was a monument to malicious compliance, a glowing pink middle finger to petty tyrants everywhere. People would slow down their cars just to look at it. Some of the neighborhood kids started calling it the Pink Spaghetti Yard. But eventually, I had to admit the truth to myself. It was, genuinely, a hideous eyesore. It was blindingly bright, completely impractical, and stepping over it to get to my front door was getting really annoying. So after the new HOA board was elected, a board comprised of normal, reasonable human beings who actually wanted to improve the neighborhood instead of policing it, I struck a deal. The new board formally rewrote the CCNRs. They added a grandfather clause protecting any existing water conservation systems, but implemented a reasonable restriction on the use of high-visibility industrial colors in residential front yards. In exchange for my cooperation in revising the bylaws, the HOA paid me a settlement of $4,000 to cover the exact cost of the specialized agricultural tubing and my labor. I used the money to hire Sal and his crew to come back out, rip up all 5,000 feet of the pink plastic, and install a beautiful, modern, completely normal underground drip irrigation system for some actual desert landscaping. Sal even took the spools of magenta hose back with him. He said he was going to chop it up and sell it as scrap. But honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if he used it to terrorize another overbearing HOA somewhere down the line. So, what's the takeaway here, guys? The golden rule of malicious compliance is simple. If someone in power wants to throw the book at you, you don't just duck. You catch the book, you open it up, and you read the footnotes. Because 9 times out of 10, their greatest weapon is also their biggest weakness. You just have to know where to look.